Welcome to this series of videos for the ESRC Rethinking Retirement series, which is also supported by the EU Work Care Synergies project. In these videos we're going to be looking at how retirement is changing, both in terms of people continuing to work into older age and in terms of pensions, how much pension people get, how much choice they get over retirement, and how they have additional responsibility for their retirement in future.
Okay, I think there's several areas that we need to be thinking about, but actually I want to mention the area that I think gets less attention than some others. So obviously there's the workers themselves, or older workers, people that are coming up to retirement age are thinking about it. There's also the welfare policies, state provisions, etc. I think there's a fair bit known about those two areas. I think the third area that perhaps is less known about is employers. So in terms of actually what employers think about rethinking retirement, extending working lives, and the roles that they play in actually deciding whether or not they're going to keep people and work for longer, the types of jobs that they're going to do, the opportunities that they might have, the ways in which workers leave work and go into retirement, and the role employers play in that, I think is the less researched area.
Well, I think one of the things that we get wrong when we think about retirement is that we think about it as a very individual decision. We think about someone deciding to work for a bit longer, or maybe thinking about the moment that they're going to retire. And although that's not entirely wrong, actually that individual is probably in a particular domestic context. So they're in a family, they have a partner, and when they're thinking about retirement, they'll be thinking about it in that household context. And yet all of policy and a lot of the academic literature, a lot of the research that's done, a lot of the surveys that are done, focus on the individual, and they don't embed the individual in their social context. So I hope one of the things that we will do in this series is start to embed and rethink retirement in its kind of domestic and household context.
I'm going to mostly talk about the United States. And in the United States, it seems to me that when we think about retirement, we have to realize that we have several different sources of retirement income, and they're all at risk. And so we're really, I think, at a sort of a watershed moment in U.S. history. Are we going to shore up these programs and provide older people with, reliable and useful economic security in old age, or are we going to let these programs sort of be dismantled and drift away? For decades, we worried about privatization. There was a tremendous effort to talk about privatizing Social Security. So you would divert your payroll tax into an individual account. Now, this might work out great for you. If you were the lucky person whose investments went splendidly, then you would have a comfortable old age retirement. But if you were like everyone else, certainly like me, and your investments didn't do well, it was really hard to say what your income was going to be like in old age. So this was a very high-risk solution. Many of us who are advocates for Social Security have spent a lot of time preparing to defend against that proposal. That proposal slipped by the wayside pretty much when the stock market crashed about a year and a half ago. But what really surprised us just before the holidays this year was Congress and the President joined forces to put through what they called a payroll tax holiday. And for me, this is very troublesome change. Right now, we pay 6.2% into Social Security out of each paycheck. The payroll tax holiday, you just pay 4.2% for this year of 2011. This means that the money shored up for the baby boom is going to disappear much more rapidly because we're not putting money in as fast this year as we had been. But it's especially troubling because at the end of the year, well, two things. First of all, the President promised us that Congress would subsidize the lost monies would be repaid through general revenues. But I see no legislation to do that, and I'm concerned that there will never be legislation to repay those monies. And then the second thing is the payroll tax holiday doesn't expire, so Congress has to actually take action to put the payroll tax back up to 6%. Now at that point, that's going to look like a 50% tax increase to people, from 4% up to 6%, and so we're very, very concerned that there'll be no support for that. So this was not a thing we saw coming. It's not a thing that the old age interest groups had very much time at all to prepare to defend against, and it was slipped in by a president who campaigned to be very, very supportive of Social Security.
Well, I think one of the big challenges is that we live longer, which is a good thing, certainly, but we also tend to retire early, which somehow doesn't work together. So I think we have to think about ways in which we can maintain people longer in the work process and have a more gradual transition to retirement. I mean, some people that are on early retirement actually then in studies, we can see that they actually don't have so much benefits from it. Everyone aspires to retire early, but basically often this is more related to health issues and other things, other problems. So in continental Europe there were more possibilities to go on early retirement, from your normal pension over unemployment insurance that you could draw and so on. In the UK it has been a much more limited phenomenon and more tied to the economic ups and downs and employers' policies and occupational pensions giving some possibility for early retirement in some cases but not in others. So we see large differences. However, there's a general trend towards reversing early retirement, even in continental Europe. So about half of continental Europeans are in the age group 60 to 64 already on early retirement. And that's different in the UK, where it's about 20%.
For me, the key issue is that retirement is not, it's a kind of truism to say this, retirement is not a uniform process. It's not a single discrete event that happens for people. It varies across different groups of the population and so on. But I think what's important here is that it's not randomly distributed across the population. We know that patterns of retirement vary over time. They vary over place. Different countries and so on have different patterns of retirement. But importantly, I think retirement relates to working conditions and also to factors such as class and socioeconomic position. So if it's the kind of route into retirement that's important, then simply thinking about ways of keeping people in work is not sufficient. We need to think about the different ways in which people leave work, why they leave work in different ways, and then how we address that in terms of improving people's working conditions as well as keeping them in work. So if people are leaving work early because they're being made unemployed, then simply providing a set of sticks to get them back into work doesn't necessarily solve the problem of their later life well-being.
We should be thinking about a couple of things. First of all, the quality of life for people, for older workers leading up to retirement. And then we also need to be thinking about those, the longer term consequences for older people, so post-retirement issues, so that people have an adequate standard of living, are not in poverty, have the opportunity to do a range of activities, whatever that might be. In terms of our own remit at the HRC, we're obviously, our remit is issues of equality between different groups, so gender, age, disability, sexual orientation, etc. So it's, as well as looking kind of overall in terms of quality, it's also looking at, are there inequalities between groups, and we know there are, and how do we prevent these widening and hopefully trying to reduce them in a climate of economic difficulties and economic recession, where the danger is that such inequalities will widen rather than reduce.
I think we need to be thinking not just about people extending their employment, but also extending their care obligations, including childcare obligations. So we know that in Scotland the most common form of childcare provision beyond the parents is by grandparents. So maybe we need to think about how we can enable grandparents to combine employment and childcare in the same way that we think about parents combining childcare and employment. Using the Growing Up in Scotland survey, which is a survey of about 5% of children born in a certain cohort, in Scotland we know that grandparents provide more informal childcare than any other form. So parents are turning to their parents to provide childcare when they're working. This is where some private business is leading the way. They're recognising that some of their employees are needing to take time out to combine childcare again, if you like, the second time round, with employment. Asda's been probably the leader in this country, and suggesting the idea of grandparental leave, much along the same lines as, say, parental leave as we see for parents. So extending the kind of care obligations also, as well as the employment obligations, into later life.
I think we've got to think about the health inequalities in the UK, because the life expectancy issues between the richest and the poorest are still ridiculously high. So it's getting information about on the public health agenda, but also thinking in a broader context that when people retire, it's not just about health, it's about their social context. It could be about caring, it could be all sorts of different issues, and it's understanding that there are a variety of different issues that help people make those decisions.
I think we ought to be thinking very much more about the way in which working life is setting up the retirement. And I think the impact of the 1980s, 1990s recession in the UK brings this out, because you had people retiring in the 1960s and 70s after a very long career with well built up pension, who also knew they were retiring at a particular point, and so they could plan their family, their house expenditure, car expenditure around that. In consequence, from the 70s, even more in the 80s into the 90s, you had people who were thrown out. And there was absolutely no planning, and the degree of poverty, inequality that suffered. If you set that against a wider context of inequality that's occurring in our society, I think we're moving towards much greater inequalities in old age and much worse conditions for people in old age that we really haven't started thinking about.
People are now really faced with a lot of privatization in the pensions system and a lot of individualization. And these two developments threaten actually the pension coverage of a large part of the population. These new patterns of private covers really scattered and really depends on your employment status, your gender, and people are myopic, so they don't take out private pension cover. And even if it's sometimes offered by the employer, people think, oh, it's not worth it, I don't have right now the means to pay for my pension, so they tend to opt out of these pension schemes and are faced with quite low pension income in old age.
We need to be concerned about the fact that people who are reaching retirement age are staying much, much longer in retirement than they ever used to. We are asking people to work longer, but in fact, if we look at the population who is going to have to work longer, can that population actually meet the demands which modern working conditions seem to impose upon them?